She had dressed 100 brides for their perfect days. She had zipped up silk, pinned lace, and pressed handkerchiefs into trembling hands. She had whispered, "You look beautiful," until those words felt like breathing. But no one had ever looked at Grace Whitmore the way he did. He walked through the glass door of Something Blue Bridal Boutique on an ordinary Tuesday in October, and in the span of a single heartbeat, the whole ordinary world cracked open. He was all wrong for the room. Too broad-shouldered for the silk drapes, too dark for the ivory walls, too still for a place that hummed and fluttered with possibility. His jaw was set like carved granite, and his eyes, dark as the Savannah River at midnight, swept the boutique with the same quiet, measuring intensity a man uses when he surveys enemy terrain. He wasn't there to buy a dress. He wasn't there for anyone else either. He was there because God, in all his mysterious and relentless grace, had decided that this was the precise moment two broken lives would collide, and that only one of them yet knew they were broken. This is the story of Grace Whitmore and Caleb Mercer, a story about silk and steel, about frills and foxholes, about the kind of love that costs everything, and the one who paid it first. Welcome to the Blessed Christian Storyteller. If this is your first time here, I want you to make yourself comfortable, because what I have for you today is not just a story. It is a testimony wrapped in fiction, a love letter wrapped in drama, and a gospel truth wrapped in the most beautiful kind of heartache you will ever feel. Before we dive in, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that God's love is the greatest romance of all. And now, let us begin. Savannah, Georgia in October wore its beauty like a woman who had long stopped trying to impress anyone. The Spanish moss draped lazily from the live oaks along Abercorn Street. The cobblestones glistened after a morning rain. The air smelled of magnolia and river salt, and something older, something that the city had been exhaling since before the Civil War, a quiet, stubborn perfume of survival. Grace Whitmore had lived here all 32 years of her life, and she still caught her breath every single morning when she unlocked the wrought iron gate of Something Blue. The boutique sat on a corner of Jones Street, tucked between a florist named Lily and a stationery shop that smelled of cedar and old ink. The facade was painted the softest shade of dusty rose, not pink. Grace always corrected anyone who called it pink. "It's blush," she would say, with the gentle but firm conviction of a woman who had built her entire kingdom on the precise difference between almost and exactly. Inside, Something Blue was a dream made tangible. Gowns floated on padded silk hangers like clouds captured in fabric. Tulle and charmeuse, illusion netting and Duchess satin, hand-beaded bodices that caught the chandelier light and scattered it into 1,000 tiny stars. Veils pooled softly in their display cases, satin sashes the color of champagne and blush, and the deepest midnight blue curled in decorative baskets. A fainting couch in the center of the fitting room was upholstered in pearl gray velvet, positioned precisely so that the bride stepping off the pedestal in her chosen gown would look up and see herself in 3 simultaneous mirrors: past, present, and future, Grace always thought. She had opened Something Blue 7 years ago with a business loan, a prayer, and the unswerving conviction that every woman deserved to feel like the most beautiful version of herself on the day she pledged her heart to another. Grace had no memory of her own mother. She had died when Grace was 4, leaving behind only a photograph, a bottle of Chanel No. 5, and the single blue hairpin that Grace kept in the velvet drawer beside the register, Something Blue. Her father, Harold Whitmore, had raised her alone in a tidy Victorian house on Gaston Street, reading to her from C.S. Lewis and Agatha Christie in equal measure, teaching her to make proper biscuits on Sunday mornings, and dancing with her to old Patsy Cline records in the kitchen after supper. He was the best man Grace had ever known. He was also, quietly and without fanfare, a man of deep and steady faith. Grace's faith, by contrast, was decorative, like a cross hanging on a wall, present, acknowledged, occasionally admired, but not really lived in. She had been baptized as a child. She attended church on Christmas and Easter. She said grace before meals, mostly out of habit and love for her father. She believed in God the way she believed in gravity, as an undisputed fact that she didn't feel any particular urgency to examine. She had a business to run. She had brides to dress. She had invoices and inventory and Instagram and a staff of 3 that depended on her. She was, by all external measures, a woman who had her life beautifully arranged. And then Caleb Mercer walked through her door. It was a Tuesday. Grace remembered it afterward with the peculiar precision that the mind assigns to the moments that rearrange everything. She had been in the back fitting room helping a bride named Cassidy decide between a cathedral-length train and a sweep when she heard the small bell above the front door chime. "I'll be right out," she called, using the bright, professional voice she had perfected over years of managing expectations and emotions simultaneously. She stepped out from behind the velvet curtain and stopped. He was standing in the center of the boutique looking profoundly, almost comically out of place. 6'3" at least, dark hair cut military short, a jaw that looked like someone had rendered it in charcoal with a heavy, confident hand. His hands were at his sides, slightly open, the way a man holds himself when he has been trained to be ready for anything. He was looking at a mannequin in a pearl-white A-line gown as if he were trying to solve it. Grace felt something happen in her chest. Not a flutter, not a skip, something more structural than that, as if a wall she didn't know she had built suddenly developed a crack, just one, just hairline thin, but enough to let light in. She recovered immediately. She was a professional. "Good morning," she said, walking forward with her clipboard and her smile. "Welcome to Something Blue. Can I help you?" He turned, and his eyes, Lord have mercy, his eyes, were the darkest brown she had ever seen. Not cold, not hard, just very deep, like a well you could drop a stone into and never hear it hit the bottom. "I need a bridesmaid's dress," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had never needed to shout to be heard. Grace blinked. "A bridesmaid's dress?" "My sister's getting married. She asked me to handle it." A beat. The corner of his mouth tightened, not quite a wince. "She said she trusts my judgment." "Ah," Grace tilted her head. "And does she know that bridesmaids' dresses are," she gestured at the pale pink explosion of tulle and ribbon, "rather specific. There are measurements involved, fabric choices, colors." She sent her measurements and a picture of the color she wants. He reached into the pocket of his jeans and produced a folded piece of paper with the careful precision of a man presenting military intelligence. She calls it dusty sage. Grace took the paper, unfolded it, looked at the careful, neat handwriting, then looked up at him. "Your sister wrote this?" "I wrote it. She told me. I wrote it down." Something warm moved through Grace before she could stop it. This enormous man, with his soldier's posture and his granite jaw, had stood in front of his sister and carefully taken notes on dusty sage bridesmaids' dresses. "Well," Grace said, tucking the paper into her clipboard, "you'll better come with me." His name was Caleb Mercer, and he told her very little about himself that first visit. Grace would learn more later, in pieces, the way you learn a landscape by traveling through it in the dark, feeling the contours before you see them. But that first Tuesday, she learned the surface facts, that he had served in the Navy for 11 years, that he was now running a private security consulting firm on a Drayton Street, and that his sister, Naomi, was the only family he had left. Parents? Grace asked, because she asked all her clients about their families. It was part of her process, understanding the human architecture beneath the occasion. "Gone," he said, simply, without particular pain, the way a man says it who has made his peace long ago with things that once broke him. "I'm sorry," Grace said. "Don't be." He looked at her directly. "It made me who I am."
She believed him. There was nothing about Caleb Mercer that suggested fragility. He sat in the consultation chair, the pale pink velvet one that Grace privately called the Duchess chair, with the specific brand of patience that belonged only to men who had learned to wait in absolute stillness for very long periods of time. He did not fidget. He did not check his phone. He looked at Grace when she spoke to him, and he listened with his entire face, the way most people had long since forgotten how to do. It was, Grace would think later, possibly the most quietly unnerving thing about him. She showed him fabric swatches in 15 shades of green. He held each one up to the boutique's north-facing window with the concentration of a man performing a forensic analysis. He asked questions, good questions, specific ones, about drape and flow, and whether the fabric would move well in photographs. Grace blinked at that. "My sister is very photogenic," he said, as explanation, with a faint note of elder brother pride that was so pure and so unexpected that Grace felt the crack in her chest widen, just slightly. They settled on a silk charmeuse in dusty sage with a simple off-shoulder neckline and a gathered skirt. Grace took careful notes. She would need to place the order and have the gown altered. Naomi Mercer, it turned out, was getting married in 7 weeks. 7 weeks, Grace repeated, checking her production calendar. That's tight. Is it possible? She looked up. He was watching her with those deep water eyes, steady and completely unworried. It was not arrogance. It was simply the expectation, bedrock solid, that capable people find solutions. It's possible, Grace said. Good. He stood, a movement that filled the room in a way that a man of lesser physical presence could never have managed. He reached across the consultation table and shook her hand. His grip was warm, controlled, and exactly as firm as it needed to be. "I'll need your card." Grace gave it to him. He looked at it the way he had looked at the fabric swatches, carefully, thoroughly, then slid it into his wallet. "You'll hear from me," he said. He left. The bell above the door chimed, and Something Blue felt, in his absence, slightly less solid than it had before he arrived, as if the room itself was aware that something specific was missing from it. Grace stood at her consultation table for a full 30 seconds, her clipboard in her hands, not writing anything. Her assistant, Maya, appeared from behind the curtain with the expression of a woman who had been eavesdropping and was entirely unashamed of it. "Grace," Maya said. "Don't," Grace said. "I'm just saying." "Don't." Maya grinned and disappeared. Grace looked down at her clipboard. In the box where she typically wrote the client's name and contact information, she had written Caleb Mercer, sister Naomi, Dusty Sage, 7 weeks. Without consciously deciding to do so, she had also written his name twice. He came back on Friday. This was not, Grace told herself, remarkable. Bride's family members returned all the time, for fittings, for updates, for any number of entirely professional reasons. It was completely normal for a client to return. It was less normal for that client to arrive with 2 cups of coffee from the shop on Whitaker Street. She later discovered he had asked Maya what Grace's order was, and to set one down on her consultation table with the quiet matter-of-factness of a man delivering supplies to someone on a long march. "You didn't have to do that," Grace said. "You were here when I walked by at 7:30 this morning. The lights were on." Grace stared. "How do you know what time I'm here?" "I run this route every morning," he said it simply, without any suggestion that this was significant. "I noticed." He had noticed. This man, this former Navy SEAL with eyes like deep water, had noticed that she was here early. Grace picked up the coffee. It was made exactly right. "Have you heard back on the fabric order?" he asked, sitting in the Dutch's chair as if he had always sat there. 2 weeks out, Grace said. "I called in a favor. We'll make Naomi's deadline." "Good." A pause. He looked around the boutique with something that was not quite appraisal and not quite comfort, something between the two. "Do you design them, the gowns?" "Some of them. The exclusive line in the back. Those are mine." Grace hesitated, then said, "I studied design in New York City for 2 years before I came home." "Why did you come home?" No one had ever asked her that so directly. Most people assume they knew why. Savannah girl comes back to Savannah. Of course she does. It's Savannah. But Caleb Mercer was not most people, and his question was not assumption. It was genuine inquiry. "My father was sick," Grace said. "He recovered, but I was already home and I realized I wanted to stay." She looked at him. And I realized that what I actually wanted to make wasn't avant-garde fashion. It was the kind of dress a woman remembers for the rest of her life. Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's not a small thing." "No," agreed Grace. "It isn't." They talked for another hour, or rather, Grace talked and Caleb listened, and occasionally said things that were so precisely on point that Grace found herself revising her mental map of him. He was not the strong, silent type in the cliched sense, the man who said little because he felt little. He was the strong, silent type in the true sense, the man who said little because he observed everything, and when he spoke, it was because he had something worth saying. He told her he'd been to 19 countries, that he spoke serviceable Arabic, that he once spent 4 days without sleep on a mission in a place he could not name, and that the hardest thing was not the physical deprivation, but the quiet between things, when you have too much time to think about what could go wrong. Grace thought of her brides on their wedding mornings. "I know that quiet," she said. He looked at her. "Do you?" "Every time I zip up a dress, there's a moment just before the bride turns to the mirror, this pause. And in that pause, she's calculating every what if. What if I'm making a mistake? What if he doesn't love me the way I love him? What if I'm not enough?" Grace set down her coffee. "My job is to make that moment as short as possible." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "That's a good job." And somehow, from him, it was the highest compliment Grace had ever received. By the 3rd week, Grace was in trouble and she knew it. Caleb Mercer came to Something Blue twice a week, always with coffee, always with a precise and reasonable explanation, an update on Naomi's measurements, a question about the alterations, a logistics inquiry about the rehearsal dinner boutonniere. Each visit was brief, professional, and entirely justifiable, and each visit left Grace standing a little longer at her consultation table after he'd gone, her clipboard in her hands, not writing anything. Maya was no longer pretending not to notice. "He's not coming here about the dress," Maya said on a Wednesday morning, watching Caleb's tall form disappear through the door. "He absolutely is," Grace said. "Grace, honey, he emailed me the measurements update at midnight. He didn't need to come in this morning to tell you about it. He was passing by on his run. He reroutes his entire run to pass this street. I looked at his previous route on his... Never mind how I know that. The point is," Maya set her hands on her hips, "the point is that man is building something, and it's not a wedding gown." Grace said nothing. Because Maya was right, and she knew it, and she didn't know what to do with that knowledge except fold it carefully and set it aside. Because there was a problem. Caleb Mercer was, as far as Grace could observe, a man of deep and genuine faith. It wasn't that he wore it loudly. He didn't arrive with a Bible under his arm or punctuate his sentences with scripture, the way Grace had occasionally encountered in clients who used religion as social currency. It was subtler than that. It was the grace he said before eating the lunch he'd brought to one of their longer appointment-adjacent conversations, just a brief, private bow of the head, lips moving almost silently. It was the way he mentioned his church the way other people mentioned a family home, with a specific kind of belonging. It was the small and utterly sincere way he said, once, about a particularly difficult period after leaving the Navy, "I don't think I would have made it without the Lord." No performance, no agenda, just a statement of fact offered without self-consciousness and without invitation for debate. Grace had nodded and said, "I'm glad you made it," and changed the subject smoothly the way she always did when God entered a conversation she wasn't prepared to have. But the trouble was growing, because Grace Whitmore, who had always prided herself on the clean architecture of her emotional life, everything in its proper place, no drafts getting in, was discovering that Caleb Mercer was a very large draft, and the walls were not holding. She thought about him in the evenings when the boutique was closed and she was alone upstairs in her apartment with a glass of sweet tea and a designed sketchbook. She thought about the way he listened, the way he said her name, not Grace with the easy familiarity that most people used, but Grace with a slight pause before it, as if he had decided the word deserved its full weight.
She thought about the phone call on a rainy Thursday night when he had called with a question about the gown hemline, and they had talked for 2 hours about architecture and loneliness and what it means to build a life after the life you planned falls apart. She thought about the fact that he had never once in all these weeks been anything but respectful. He had never pushed, never crowded. He was simply present in the way that solid things are present. You didn't have to touch them to know they were real. On a Saturday afternoon in early November, Grace drove to her father's house on Gaston Street for supper, sat down across from Harold Whitmore's kind, perceptive face, and said, "I think I'm falling in love with someone, and I don't know what to do about it." Harold Whitmore set down his fork. He looked at his daughter with those gentle, seeing eyes. "Tell me about him," he said. Grace told him, all of it, and when she was done, Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "He sounds like a man who knows what he believes." "Yes," Grace said. "And you, sweetheart, do you know what you believe?" Grace looked at her biscuit. "I believe in a lot of things, Daddy." "That isn't what I asked." She drove home in the dock and sat in the parking lot behind the boutique for a long time, the engine off and the radio silent, feeling the questions settle over her like a weight she couldn't quite identify yet. Naomi Mercer was 27 years old, with her brother's dark eyes and a laugh that arrived without warning like sunshine through a gap in clouds. She came to Something Blue for her final fitting on a Thursday in mid-November, and within approximately 4 minutes, Grace understood completely why Caleb loved her so fiercely. Naomi stood on the pedestal in her gown, a romantic ball gown in ivory crepe with a lace overlay, a cathedral train, and a sweetheart neckline that Grace had designed herself, and burst into tears. "Don't cry, you'll smear your mascara," Grace said, handing her a tissue, her standard line, spoken in her standard professional warmth. I know," Naomi laughed and cried simultaneously. It's exactly what I imagined. Exactly." She looked at Grace in the mirror with the full force of her emotion. "How did you know?" Grace smiled. "That's what we do here." Naomi insisted on taking Grace to lunch afterward, dismissing her protests with a wave that was strikingly similar to Caleb's particular brand of patient authority. They went to a cafe on Broughton Street over chicken salad sandwiches and sweet tea, and Naomi talked about her fiancé, Daniel, a pediatrician with a kind face and a terrible sense of direction, who got lost twice trying to find the engagement ring store and bought entirely the wrong one the first time, and Naomi loved him more for it, not less. She talked about their faith as the foundation of their relationship, the way they prayed together, the way her church community felt like her second family. And then, with the direct sweetness of a woman who had grown up watching her brother suppress everything rather than reveal it, Naomi looked across the table at Grace and said, "You know he talks about you." Grace set down her tea. Caleb?" Naomi said, "He says you're the most competent person he's ever worked with, which from Caleb is approximately the same as writing you a love poem." Naomi smiled. "He's been alone a long time. He doesn't let people in easily, but something in him has opened up since he met you, and I can see it, and I'm his sister, so I know him better than anyone, and I'm telling you that whatever this is, it's real." Grace felt the crack in her chest widen into something that no longer could be called a crack. "Naomi," she said carefully, "he's a man of faith, and I'm not really. I believe in God, but I don't have what he has. I don't have what you have." Naomi was quiet for a moment. She looked at Grace with a steadiness that was unmistakably her brother's. "Do you want it?" The question landed in Grace like a stone dropped into that deep water well, down and down and down. "I don't know," Grace said honestly. "I don't know what it would look like for me." "That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a long time," Naomi said, "and for what it's worth, wanting to know is the beginning of knowing." They walked back to Something Blue in the November afternoon, their breath visible in the cooling air, the live oaks dropping their first reluctant leaves, and something in Grace, some deep and long-sealed chamber, was beginning, quietly, to want. Caleb Mercer was a different man 3 years ago. He did not often think about that version of himself, not because the memories were too painful to face, but because he no longer recognized him. The man he had been at 35, emerging from his last deployment with 2 commendations, a dislocated shoulder, and a silence inside himself that had grown so heavy that it started to pull him toward the ground. That man felt like a stranger he felt a persistent, specific gratitude toward for not making any permanent decisions during the 18 months it took to find his way through. He had been introduced to faith the way most men like him were, through the back door of total exhaustion. His buddy Marcus, a former ranger with 3 tours and a laugh that could fill a room, had invited him to a Bible study in the back of a barber shop on Waters Avenue with the casual non-pressure of a man who knew very well that a direct invitation would be declined. "Just food," Marcus said. "Pastor Ray does a thing on Thursdays. Good food. Come for the food." There was food. Excellent food, and Pastor Raymond Cole, a 73-year-old man with hands like catcher's mitts and a voice that seemed to have its origins somewhere below the surface of the earth, had been teaching from the book of Isaiah. "They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles." Caleb had sat in the back with a plate of collards and rice and felt those words move through him in a way he could not explain and still could not fully explain, only that it was like the sensation of a window opening in a room that had been closed for a long time. He had gone back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and eventually it was not just Thursdays. And one Sunday morning in January of the previous year, Caleb Mercer had walked to the front of the church and knelt and given the whole exhausted weight of himself to God, and the weight had not disappeared, he was not that naive, but it had been redistributed in a way that made it, for the first time in years, bearable. He had been building his life steadily since then. His business, his church community, the Friday morning men's group that met in Pastor Ray's kitchen at 6 a.m. and talked about what it meant to be men of God in the specific and daily sense. His relationship with Naomi, repaired, deepened, anchored. And then Grace Whitmore. He had not expected Grace Whitmore. He had walked into Something Blue Bridal Boutique expecting to complete a task, get the bridesmaid's dress information, deliver it to Naomi, move on. He was good at completing tasks. 11 years of the Navy had made him excellent at completing tasks. And then she had walked out from behind that velvet curtain, this small, precise, beautiful woman with her clipboard and her professional smile and her absolute calm. And something in Caleb had shifted, deep in the foundation, in a way that no amount of training had prepared him for. He had gone back on Friday with the coffee because he wanted to. He had routed his morning run down Jones Street because he wanted to see her lights on in the early dark and know she was there. He had invented reasons to return because being in her presence was... There was no military language for it. It was simply good. It was simply the specific and unreasonable feeling of being in the right place. He had prayed about it, specifically and at length, in the habit he had developed of bringing everything to God, with the directness he would use to brief a commanding officer. "Lord, is this what I think it is? And if it is, what do I do with it?" The answer that settled over him, slow and sure as winter light, was not what he had hoped. He had been listening to Pastor Ray preach through 2 Corinthians, and when they reached the passage about not being unequally yoked, about the fundamental impossibility of building a shared life on unmatched foundations, Caleb had felt it land in his chest with the specific weight of a truth he had been hoping to avoid. He did not doubt Grace's character. He did not doubt her kindness or her intelligence or the generosity of her spirit. But he knew, with the same calm, non-negotiable certainty that had kept him alive in 19 countries, that a marriage built on mismatched spiritual foundations was not the marriage God intended, and that whatever he felt for Grace Whitmore, whatever this warmth and wanting and rightness was, he could not act on it until the foundations matched. He knew what this meant. It meant stepping back. It meant creating distance. It meant doing one of the hardest things he had ever been called to do, harder in its particular way than anything the Navy had asked of him, which was to choose faithfulness over feeling. He sat in his truck outside Something Blue for a long time on a cold November morning, his hands on the steering wheel, the 2 coffees on the seat beside him, and he prayed. Lord, she's the first thing in a long time that has felt like coming home, and I believe you brought her into my life for a reason. But if this is going to be what I think it is, if this is going to be real, then it has to be right. So I'm giving it to you, all of it, whatever you want to do with it." He picked up the coffees, he got out of the truck, he walked inside. It began subtly. The visits became less frequent, the calls shorter. Caleb still came for the final fitting logistics, for the rehearsal coordination, but something in the quality of his presence had changed. He was warm but more careful, present but more contained. He brought coffee twice more and then, without explanation, stopped. Grace noticed immediately. She noticed the way you notice when a familiar sound goes quiet, not with alarm at first, just with a vague awareness that something has shifted. Then the awareness sharpened into understanding, and the understanding sharpened into hurt. She had done nothing wrong. She reviewed their conversations with the forensic precision of a woman who needed to understand cause and effect, and she could identify no transgression, no misstep, no moment where she had pushed too hard or said too much. She had simply been herself, and somehow that had not been enough. Or perhaps, and this thought was worse, she was too much. Too decorated, too pink. Perhaps Caleb Mercer, with his military precision and his quiet faith and his deep water eyes, had looked at Grace Whitmore and her tool-filled kingdom and thought, "This is not the life I want." She did not cry about it at the boutique. She was a professional. But on a Tuesday night, alone in her apartment with a design sketchbook she couldn't bring herself to draw in, she cried quietly and efficiently, the way she did everything, thoroughly, without waste, and then she washed her face and went to bed. Maya watched her with worried eyes and said nothing, which was, from Maya, the most caring thing she could have done. The week before Naomi's wedding, Caleb came in for the final coordination meeting, the timeline, the dress pickup logistics, the payment balance. He was courteous, he was precise, he was everything he had always been, and he was completely, carefully, heartbreakingly out of reach. Grace watched him through everything with her clipboard and her professional smile. She did not let anything show. She had been hiding small heartaches behind professional smiles since she was 19 years old. She was very good at it. He paused at the door on his way out. "Grace?" She looked up. Her voice was even. "Yes?" He looked at her for a long moment with those deep water eyes, and she saw something there that was not distance. It was not coldness. It was something that hurt to see because it was so clearly not indifference, but she did not have a name for it yet. "Thank you for everything you've done for Naomi." "Of course, that's what I do here." He nodded once and left. Grace stood at her consultation table for a long time. Naomi Mercer married Daniel Park on the first Saturday in December in a church on Montgomery Street that had been built in 1847 and smelled of old wood and candle wax and the particular holiness of a room that had held 2 centuries of human joy and grief. Grace was there professionally. She attended every wedding of her brides in the final hour before the ceremony, making adjustments, calming nerves, doing the small and necessary work that no one noticed and everyone needed. She stood in the bride's room with her kit of emergency supplies, needle and thread, double-sided tape, safety pins, a fresh handkerchief, and said, "You look beautiful," in her warmest, most certain voice. Naomi hugged her fiercely before she walked out. "Thank you," she said against her hair, "for everything." "Go get married," she laughed, untangling herself gently. She stood at the back of the church during the ceremony as she always did, professional, peripheral, present but not part of it. She had attended perhaps 140 weddings in 7 years. She did not usually cry at them. She had developed the useful emotional distance of a surgeon for the proceedings she facilitated. But something was different today. She watched Naomi come down the aisle on Caleb's arm, the tall, dark brother and the bright, laughing sister, and felt something catch in her throat. Caleb walked Naomi with absolute care, his hand over hers, his face doing something private and controlled and deeply tender that only her sister could have produced. He delivered her to Daniel and stepped back. He did not take his seat immediately. He stood for a moment watching his sister's face as she looked at the man she was marrying, and the expression on Caleb Mercer's face in that moment, open, unguarded, luminous with something that had nothing to do with duty or control, broke Grace Whitmore completely open. because she realized, standing at the back of a 178-year-old church with a needle and thread in her pockets and tears sliding silently down her face, that she was in love with Caleb Mercer. Not in the pleasant, manageable, professionally appropriate way she had been telling herself. Not a feeling she could fold up and set aside. Completely, helplessly, structurally in love with Caleb Mercer, the way a building is committed to its foundation. And she also realized in the same flooding moment, as the pastor began to speak about the covenant of marriage before God, that what she wanted, what she had always been standing at the edge of wanting and never had the courage to step into, was what this room was full of. Not just the man, the God. The thing that made these two people standing before the altar not just two people in love, but two people building a life on something that wouldn't shift. She did not have that. She had beautiful dresses and a business plan and a father who had quietly modeled it for 30 years, and she had never once stopped to pick it up. Pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. The pastor was reading from Ephesians, and every word was landing in Grace like something she had always needed to hear. Grace did not sleep the night after Naomi's wedding. She sat in her apartment above Something Blue, in the armchair by the window that looked out over Jones Street, and she let the question her father had asked her 2 months ago rise to the surface of her mind and stay there. Do you know what you believe? She thought about the blue hairpin in the velvet drawer downstairs, her mother's. She had grown up without a mother's faith to absorb, without a woman to kneel beside her and show her what it looked like when a woman brought her life to God with open hands. She had her father, steady as stone, but she had always thought of his faith as his particular way of being in the world, not something that was hers to claim. But what if it was? What if it had always been available to her, not as inheritance, but as invitation? She picked up the Bible from her nightstand. It was still in the shrink wrap her father had put it in when he gave it to her at her confirmation 20 years ago. She was mildly horrified by this. She peeled the shrink wrap off carefully. She opened to a random page, the way people do when they are both earnest and uncertain. She opened to John chapter 3. She read it. Then she read it again. Then she read it a third time, slower. For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. She had heard this verse hundreds of times in her life, on church marquees and Christmas cards and Sunday school paintings, and the lips of strangers on street corners. She had heard it so many times that it had become, for her, what most familiar things become, a surface rather than a depth. But sitting in her armchair at 2 a.m. with her untouched Bible open in her lap and her heart in pieces and the memory of a church full of candlelight, she read it, really read it, for what felt like the first time. He loved the world, not a version of the world that had earned it, not the world on its best days, the world, this broken, beautiful, frilly, complicated, cobblestoned, moss-draped, war-worn world. He loved it, enough to give everything. Something cracked open in Grace Whitmore that had been sealed for 32 years. It was not dramatic. There was no light from heaven, no audible voice. There was only a woman in an armchair in Savannah, Georgia at 2 a.m. with silent tears running down her face and a brand new Bible open on her lap, feeling, for the first time in her adult life, genuinely, specifically, not alone. She did not have the words yet. She barely had the shape of what was happening, but she spoke into the dark of her apartment, very quietly, in the halting way of someone learning a new language. If you're real, and I think you are, I want to know you. Not around the edges, not on Christmas. I want what my father has. I want what Naomi has. I want what Caleb has. A pause. I want you. The silence that followed was not empty. That was the thing that surprised her most. It was full. She called her father at 7 a.m. Harold Whitmore answered on the second ring with the steady voice of a man who had been expecting this call specifically for a while. Daddy, Grace said. Her voice cracked. I need to talk to you. I'll put the coffee on, he said. She drove to Gaston Street through a December morning so clear and still, it felt like the world had been washed overnight. The sun was just clearing the rooftops, turning the brick facades of the old houses amber and gold. The Spanish moss caught the light like silver thread. Savannah had never looked so beautiful to Grace, or perhaps she had never looked at it quite this way before, not as scenery, but as gift. She sat at her father's kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee and told him everything. The boutique, Caleb, the wedding, the apartment at 2 a.m. Harold listened with his eyes very soft and very steady. When she finished, he reached across the table and covered her hands with his own. Grace, he said, I have been praying for this day since you were 9 years old. She started crying again. He let her. He had always known how to let her feel things without rushing her through them. What do I do now? I don't know where to start. You already started last night in your armchair, he smiled. Everything after that is learning to walk in what you've already received. She went to church with him that Sunday, not her Christmas and Easter church, but his church on Bull Street, with its worn pews and its full-voiced choir, and Pastor Dana Cole, who was Pastor Raymond Cole's daughter-in-law, and who preached with a specific, clarifying fire that had apparently been simmering in the Cole family for 2 generations. Grace sat in the second row. Harold always sat in the second row, and she sang the hymns that she knew and stumbled through the ones she didn't. And when Pastor Dana said from the pulpit that God is not looking for perfect people, he is looking for willing ones, Grace felt something click into place in her chest, quiet and certain as a lock turning. She went back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. She started a women's Bible study on Wednesday evenings. She read her unwrapped Bible with the specific hunger of someone who had been inadvertently fasting for decades. She did not call Caleb. Not yet. Not because she didn't want to. She wanted to every single day. But because she understood in the same quiet knowing that had been developing in her since that night in the armchair, that this was not for him. This was not a performance of transformation undertaken to win someone's heart. This was hers. She was doing this because it was true, because the hunger was real, because the fullness she had felt in that apartment at 2 a.m. was more real than anything she had felt in a very long time. Whatever happened with Caleb Mercer, whatever God intended for that, would come in its time, or it wouldn't. And she was learning, slowly and not without considerable effort, to hold that possibility with open hands. Naomi Mercer came back to Something Blue in January, not as a bride this time, but as a friend, with 2 cups of coffee and the knowing expression of a woman who has been tracking something. She had returned from her honeymoon in Charleston 2 weeks prior. She sat in the Duchess chair with the ease of someone who belonged there and looked at Grace with those Mercer eyes, and Grace recognized the assessment. Something's different about you, Naomi said. Many things are different about me, Grace said. Grace. Grace set down her coffee. I've been attending church, Bull Street Chapel, with my father. Naomi's face went through a series of rapid and deeply heartfelt expressions. For how long? 6 weeks. I'm in a Wednesday Bible study. Grace paused, looking for the honest words. I'm new at this. Really new. But it's real. Naomi crossed the room and hugged her without preamble, the fierce, brief hug of a woman who means it entirely. Grace laughed into her shoulder. Does Caleb know? Naomi asked, pulling back. No. Grace's voice was quiet. And I don't want you to tell him. Naomi raised an eyebrow. This isn't about him. I don't want it to be about him. I need it to be mine. Naomi studied her for a long moment with a regard that was exactly her brother's. Then she nodded, slowly. You're right, she said. That's the right way to do it. I know, Grace said. And then with a wry smile, I'm learning. They had lunch at the cafe on Broughton Street again, and this time the conversation moved freely between faith and life and love and the ridiculous small beauties of being alive in the world. And Grace felt something she had not felt in a long time, or perhaps had never felt in quite this form. She felt, specific and clear as a bell note, peace. Caleb Mercer was not doing well. He would not have used those words. He was not a man who used words like not doing well to describe his internal states. He would have said, I'm working through something, or I'm in a difficult season. Both of these would have been accurate and deeply insufficient. The truth was that he missed Grace Whitmore with a specificity that was embarrassing and relentless. He missed the way she said his name. He missed the boutique, which he had absolutely no professional reason to ever visit again. He missed the coffee runs. He missed the conversations about architecture and loneliness, and the particular grace of making something beautiful. He'd done the right thing. He knew he had done the right thing, and it had cost him more than he had expected. Marcus noticed. On a Friday morning in January, in Pastor Ray's kitchen with bad coffee and good men around the table, Marcus looked at Caleb across the steam of his mug and said, "You look like a man who's carrying something." Caleb said, "I'm fine. You've said 11 words in the last 40 minutes, and 10 of them were Bible references."
I'm engaged with the material. Pastor Ray, who had been listening with the half attention of a man whose full attention is always on everything, set down his Bible and looked at Caleb. "Son," he said in that subterranean voice, "what is it that you're holding that the Lord is asking you to put down?" Caleb looked at him, and something in the old man's gaze, the absolute uncalculating compassion of it, broke through his composure in a way that nothing else had in months. He told them, all of it. The boutique, Grace, the decision to step back, the reasoning, the way it had felt every single day since. The men were quiet when he finished. Marcus was nodding slowly. Pastor Ray's great catcher's mitt hands were folded on the table. "You did the right thing," Pastor Ray said, "and it was the right reason. Unequal yoke is real. That passage means something, and you were right not to dismiss it." He paused. "But Caleb, how long are you going to keep mourning what you've given to God?" Caleb said nothing. "You gave it to him," Pastor Ray said. "That means it's his to do with as he sees fit. Your part is done, but the surrender has to be complete. You can't give something to God and then keep standing over it, keeping watch." Marcus, across the table, said quietly, "Sometimes the surrender is the answer, brother, not the forfeit." Caleb drove home slowly through January streets. The live oaks were bare now, gray and silver in the cold morning light. He sat in his truck in front of his building and opened his hands on the steering wheel, in the habit he had developed of making his posture match his prayer. "Lord," he said, "I gave this to you. Help me trust you with it. Whatever you're doing, whatever you're working, I trust you. Let go of the rest." The weight didn't lift, but it redistributed in the way it always did when he managed an honest surrender. And he drove his truck into the garage and went inside and made coffee and opened his Bible, and for the first time in 2 months, he felt something that approached peace. Valentine's Day in a bridal boutique is, as Grace often observed, a particular kind of irony. Something Blue was festooned with red ribbon and did not sell red ribbon, because Something Blue sold love in its most specific and permanent form: commitment gowns and promise veils, and the dresses women wore when they were pledging their whole lives. The Valentine's Day heart-on-a-sleeve variety of romance was, by comparison, endearing but incomplete. She was working late on February 14th. She almost always worked late on February 14th because she would rather work than sit alone in her apartment with the commercial machinery of romance turned up to full volume around her, when the bell above the door chimed at 7:30 in the evening. She looked up from her design table. Caleb Mercer was standing in the doorway. He was wearing a dark coat against the February chill. His hands were at his sides, slightly open in that habitual posture of readiness. His face was, she had to parse it carefully, not the careful contained face of the last 2 months. It was open, uncertain, and underneath the uncertainty, something vast and careful and warm. "We're closed," Grace said. Her voice was remarkably steady. She was mildly surprised by herself. "I know," he said. "Can I come in anyway?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she set down her pencil. "The door's open." He came in. He did not sit. He stood across the design table from her, and the distance between them was approximately 4 feet of air and 7 weeks of silence, and everything that had gone unsaid in both directions. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You don't owe me anything," Grace said. She meant it, and she didn't mean it simultaneously. "Grace," there it was, that pause before her name, that wait. "I stepped back from you because I was afraid, not of you, of what I wanted." He looked at her directly. "I wanted everything, and I couldn't have it the way I wanted it." She said nothing. Let him say it. "I couldn't be with someone who didn't share my faith," he said, "not as an ultimatum, not as a test, but because what I have with God is the foundation of everything else I am, and I can't build something real on a crack in the foundation." He paused. "It was the hardest thing I've done, and I've done some hard things." Grace looked at him for a long time. The chandelier was throwing its small constellations of light across the gowns around them. The boutique was very quiet. "I've been attending church," she said. "Bull Street Chapel. 6 weeks. Before you ask, no, not because of you. Because of me." Something moved in Caleb's face. He was very still. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Not everything, not yet, but the shape of it. The wedding, the apartment, the armchair, the Bible and the shrink wrap, the fullness in the silence. Caleb was looking at her with the expression he had worn when he walked Naomi down the aisle, open, unguarded, luminous. "Grace," he said very quietly. "I'm not telling you so that you'll," she started. I know you're not. That's why I'm listening." He took one step forward. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Is it real?" There was no hedging in the question, no test or trick, just those deep water eyes, asking the only thing that actually mattered. "Yes," Grace said. "I don't know all of it yet. I'm learning. But the foundation," she stopped, shook her head at herself, at the word she had chosen. "The foundation is real." He held out his hand across the design table. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was simply his hand, open, palm up, offered, waiting. Grace looked at it for a moment, at the strength in it, at the quiet in it, at everything it had carried. She put her hand in his. "Start over," he said. "Start over," she said. And in the soft chandelier light of Something Blue, surrounded by 100 gowns that had been witness to the beginning of 100 stories, 2 people held on to each other in the specific and reverent way of people who understand that what they have been given is not owed to them and not to be wasted. They took it slowly. This was Caleb's word, and Grace honored it because she understood, after everything, that slowly was not reluctance. It was respect, the slow accumulation of real things. They had coffee on Saturday mornings at the shop on Whitaker Street. They took long walks through Forsyth Park in the gray February afternoons, the fountain still and silent in the cold, the live oaks casting their bare winter shadows. They attended church together, sometimes his church on Waters Avenue, sometimes hers on Bull Street, sometimes Pastor Ray's Thursday evening study, which Grace fell in love with immediately, the back of a barbershop warmth of it, the way Pastor Ray's voice seemed to pull the scriptures up from the ground, like groundwater. Grace was a diligent student of faith in the way she was a diligent student of everything she cared about, thorough, specific, persistent. She asked the uncomfortable questions. She wrestled with the hard passages. She brought her doubts into the room and put them on the table, and Pastor Ray received them with the matter-of-fact patience of a man who had heard them all and was unsurprised by none of them. Doubt is not the opposite of faith. Certainty is the opposite of faith. Doubt is its companion. She and Caleb talked about everything, the way two people talk when they have been storing up conversation for weeks. He told her about Fallujah, and she told him about New York. He told her about the night Marcus took him to the barbershop Bible study, and she told him about the armchair at 2 in the morning. He told her about his parents, who had been good people, ordinary people, taken too soon by an accident on I-95 when he was 30 and Naomi was 22, and she told him about the blue hairpin in the velvet drawer and her mother's photograph. "She would have liked you," Grace said once, quietly. Caleb looked at her. "Yeah?" "She had good taste," Grace smiled, "according to my father." He laughed. It was the rare sound, low and true, and it was the best thing Grace had ever heard in a room that had heard a great many beautiful things. On a Saturday in March, he took her to the Tybee Island Lighthouse, a 45-minute drive east of Savannah, out to where the Savannah River met the Atlantic, and they climbed to the top in the blustery coastal wind and stood at the railing, looking out at the gray-green ocean stretching to the horizon. "I used to come here when I first got back," Caleb said, "when things were bad. I'd drive out and stand up here and look at the water and try to..." He paused, looking for the word. "Calibrate." "Did it work?" "Eventually." He turned to look at her. She was windblown and vivid, her dark hair escaping its pins, her cheeks bright with cold, her eyes steady. He looked at her for a long time. "Grace, yes? I love you." The wind took the words and scattered them over the Atlantic, and Grace Whitmore, who had dressed 100 brides, who had zipped up silk and pressed handkerchiefs into trembling hands, who had whispered, "You look beautiful," until it felt like breathing, Grace felt those 3 words land in her like something that had been on its way to her for a long time, traveling a great distance, arriving exactly when it was supposed to. "I love you too," she said. He took her hand, there at the top of the lighthouse, with the Atlantic below them and the sky enormous above, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. There was nothing else that needed to be said. He asked her father first. Of course he did. Grace found out about this afterward, several weeks afterward, when Harold mentioned it with the satisfied expression of a man who has watched something come beautifully together. "He came to the house on a Tuesday evening," Harold told her, "in March. I offered him coffee. He declined, sat down in the parlor and said, 'Mr. Whitmore, I would like to marry your daughter. I want to tell you who I am before I ask her, so that you can tell me if there's anything about me that gives you reason for concern.'" Harold shook his head with quiet admiration. "I've been waiting for a man like that for 32 years. "Daddy, he didn't tell me about that conversation." "He asked me not to. He wanted to tell you himself." Harold patted her hand. "He's a good man, sweetheart. The solid kind." The proposal happened on a Sunday afternoon in April in the bridal boutique, after closing time. Grace had been working late. She almost always worked late. And Caleb had come by at 6 with Thai food from the place on Drayton Street, which had become their Sunday evening tradition. They ate at the consultation table, surrounded by gowns and veils and the amber light of the chandelier, talking about the week and the sermon and a new design Grace was working on. And then Caleb set down his chopsticks and looked at her. And the quality of his looking was different, something in it that Grace had never quite seen before. That blend of absolute certainty and absolute vulnerability that she had been learning in their months together was the most uniquely Caleb of all his expressions. "I have something to say," he said. Grace set down her chopsticks too. "Okay." He did not get down on one knee immediately. He spoke first, because of course he did, because he had prepared what he wanted to say with the care that this man applied to everything that mattered, and Grace would not have had it any other way. "7 months ago," he said, "I walked into this room to buy a bridesmaid dress. I was a man who had rebuilt his life on a good foundation. I had my faith, I had my work, I had Naomi. I had everything I thought I needed." He looked at her directly. "And then I met you, and I realized I hadn't known what I was missing until you were in the room.
Not because you complete me, that is not how I believe it works, and I think you know that, but because God put you in my path and said, this is the partner I have for you. This is the person who will walk beside you and challenge you and make you better and let you do the same for her. Grace's eyes were full. She was not going to cry before the question. She was going to hold it together. She absolutely was not going to be able to hold it together. I watched you find your faith, Caleb said. Not for me, for yourself. And I want you to know that that was the most extraordinary thing I have ever witnessed. Not because it changed what was possible between us, though it did, but because I watched someone I love walk toward God, and nothing has ever been so beautiful. He stood up, he reached into his jacket pocket, he knelt. The ring was a single oval diamond, set in rose gold, simple and specific and utterly perfect. Grace Whitmore, will you marry me? Will you let me love you and pray with you and build this life with you on the foundation that is the only one that holds? Grace was crying. She was a professional, and she was crying, and she didn't care at all. Yes, she said. Of course, yes. He put the ring on her finger. He stood. He held her face in his hands and looked at her with those deep water eyes, and she looked back. And between them, in the boutique full of gowns and veils and chandelier light, in the room that had held so many beginnings, there was a fullness that was not their own, and they both knew it, and they were both, in their very different ways, grateful. They married in September. The church was Bull Street Chapel because it was Grace's church, and because Pastor Dana Cole performed the ceremony with the same specific, clarifying fire she brought to her sermons, and because Naomi and Daniel and Marcus and Pastor Ray and Harold and Maya and 40 other people who had in one way or another been part of this story filled the pews with a warmth that had nothing to do with September weather. Grace designed her own gown, of course. It took her 6 weeks in 4 versions. It was silk charmeuse in the most perfect ivory, not white, ivory, because she was a woman who understood the precise difference between almost and exactly. The silhouette was clean, a bias-cut column that moved like water, that settled against her as if it had always belonged there. The back was open to the waist, because she designed it and she could make whatever choices she wanted. There was no train, there was a cathedral-length wail, because something should have depth, and because she wanted, when she walked, to feel the fabric of this moment extend behind her. In the velvet drawer beside the register at Something Blue, she found her mother's blue hairpin. She wore it under her veil. Something blue. Harold Whitmore walked her down the aisle with the composure that lasted approximately to the second step before he abandoned it entirely, and Grace squeezed her arm and laughed, which made him laugh, which made the whole church laugh, and the whole church laughing on a September morning in Savannah, Georgia, was the most purely joyful sound Grace had ever heard. At the end of the aisle, Caleb was standing. He was in a simple dark suit, no tie, and he looked exactly like himself. No performance, no ceremony, just Caleb. His hands were at his sides, slightly open, in his habitual posture of readiness. But his face was doing all of that open, unguarded, luminous thing that Grace had first seen at Naomi's wedding, amplified to a scale that made her breath leave her body entirely. Harold delivered her with a kiss on her forehead and a whispered, "Your mother would have loved this," that destroyed Grace completely. And then Caleb took her hands, and the crack in her chest that had begun on an October Tuesday 7 years ago, the crack that had widened and broken her open and let the light in, sealed. Not closed, sealed. The way something heals when it has been mended properly, stronger at the break. Pastor Dana read from Ruth, "Whither thou goest, I will go," and from 1 Corinthians, the passage that Grace had first really heard at Naomi's wedding that had been working its way through her since. They said their vows. Caleb's were memorized and delivered with the directness of a man who had chosen every word deliberately and meant it, each one completely. Grace's she had written and rewritten 6 times, and when she finally spoke them, this woman who helped other women find the words for their most important moments, they arrived whole and true and hers. When it was done, Pastor Dana said, "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." And Caleb Mercer kissed his wife in a church on Bull Street in Savannah, Georgia, on a September morning in front of everyone he loved and in the presence of the God he served. And Grace Whitmore, who had dressed 100 brides, who had never once believed the fairy tale was also for her, was in every sense of the word, finally, completely, exactly where she was supposed to be. Something Blue is still on Jones Street. The facade is still blush, not pink, blush. The gowns still float on their padded hangers. The fainting couch is still positioned so that a woman stepping off the pedestal in her chosen gown will see herself in 3 simultaneous mirrors. Maya still runs the floor with the wry competence of a woman who has been right about everything she has ever predicted in this building. The velvet drawer beside the register is empty now, which is not sadness, but completion. The blue hairpin is in a display case in the Whitmore Mercer home on Jones Street. Not the apartments above the boutique, but a house. The kind of house that is built for a life rather than a living, with a porch that looks out on the live oaks and a kitchen table large enough for Sunday morning biscuits and whatever family comes with time. Harold Whitmore comes for Sunday dinners. He still reads from C.S. Lewis and Agatha Christie in equal measure. He dances with Grace in the kitchen to old Patsy Cline records, and now Caleb watches from the doorway with a coffee mug in his hand and a look on his face that is the exact expression Grace once saw from the back of a church at a wedding she was attending professionally. Open, unguarded, luminous. Caleb still runs his morning route down Jones Street before the sun is fully up. He still pauses in front of Something Blue, its lights burning in the early dark, and he gives thanks for the specific Tuesday in October when he walked through that door to buy a bridesmaid dress and came out with something infinitely greater. Grace still zips up gowns and presses handkerchiefs into trembling hands. She still whispers, "You look beautiful." But now she means it in a different and deeper dimension because she has learned that beauty, in its truest sense, is not what you are wearing, but what you are standing in. Grace, covenant, the love that holds. She has a new practice now, before each bride comes in for her appointment. She steps into the fitting room alone, just for a moment, and she is quiet. And in the quiet, she gives thanks for the boutique, for the brides, for the work, for the man at the kitchen table with his coffee and his steady presence, for the father on Gaston Street, for the God who was patient with her long hesitation and who loved her anyway before she knew enough to ask for it, for the crack in the wall that let the light in, for the foundation that holds, for the truth lived daily and imperfectly and with great love, that the greatest romance of all, the one that preceded every earthly love and makes all earthly loves possible, is the love of the one who gave everything, so that whosoever believes in him shall not perish, shall have everlasting life. That is the story of Grace and Caleb. But more than that, it is the story of what happens when a woman stops treating God like wallpaper and starts treating him like home. May it be your story too. Thank you so much for spending this time with the blessed Christian storyteller. If this story moved your heart, stirred your faith, or reminded you that God's love is the most extraordinary love of all, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, leave a comment below. I would love to know which moment in this story touched you most deeply. And remember, whether you are the bride in the fitting room calculating every what if, or the soldier who surrendered everything at the altar of faithfulness, God sees you. He knows your name. He is not finished with your story, not even close. Until next time, this is the Blessed Christian Storyteller. God bless you, keep you, and hold you in the fullness of His love. Amen.